Winston Churchill called it a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. It is a landmass equal to 1/5 of the Earth's surface, reaching from east to west nearly halfway around the world, and from the North Pole to the borders of India, a total of 9 million square miles. The size of the continental United States 3 times over. The sun never sets on this land. It may be dusk in the western region in the riverside city of Leningrad, now renamed St. Petersburg, its name before the Soviet Revolution, but simultaneously, dawn breaks on the eastern border, the frozen land near the Bering Straits, only 70 miles from Alaska, a land that sees 90-degree summers and winters as cold as 90 degrees below zero. This gigantic land was known for 7 decades as the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a wide, diverse land of contradictions and conquest. There are deep veins of gold and silver below ground, and copper, iron, tin, sulfur, magnesium. The forests cover millions upon millions of acres, 1/4 of all the lumber reserve in the world. There's coal for fuel and petroleum, one of the largest reserves in the world. Iron and factories to craft it into steel for tools of peace or weapons of war. Factories like the one at Magnitogorsk, the world's largest foundry. The great fertile fields, the steppes, the harvest lands of Georgia, Ukraine, yield grain, fruit, everything from sunflowers to cotton, where modern harvesting machines gather wheat, oats, rye, barley, and hops to feed a nation of 250 million. Cattle, herds to rival those of Texas. Grapes, tobacco, cotton, growing in the hotlands to the south, tended by hand labor by workers descended from serfs, the Russian equivalent of slaves. Historically, it's a deeply spiritual land, yet the Soviet government espoused atheism, substituting man-made gods for men made by God. Though we commonly use the terms Russia, the USSR, and the Soviet Union interchangeably, the Soviet Union was in fact a conglomerate of different nationalities, most of which spoke different languages, a Tower of Babel with 150 different tongues. And as so often happened in its history, this wide land and vastly different people were held together by a central government that could be both beneficial and brutal. More than half the Soviet Union was Russian, descendants of the first settlers of this vast area, but the Soviet Union was held together against national and historical boundaries. There were Cossacks, fabulous horsemen from the plains of the Dnieper River Valley. The Ukrainians in the southwest, formerly the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, now charting its own course as an autonomous state. Or nearby Moldavia, a people whose ancestry is Romanian, not Russian. Byelorusia, or Bessarabia on the Black Sea. The ancient mountain ranges of the Caucasus with its complex mix of religions and cultures, Azerbaijani, Armenian, Georgian, Jharkhand, Ingus. Or the great desert of Turkmenistan, Uzbek, a nation of Persian-speaking Muslims bordering Iran and India. Or Mongols, descendants of the warriors of Genghis Khan. or Turco-Tartars, Uryats, Yakuts from far beyond the Ural Mountains. And there are the ice people, hunters like the Zones, Laplanders, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians. The Soviet nation was never truly one people. The people of the nation lived in frozen huts and thatched cottages, in medieval hamlets, and cities as magnificent as any in the world. Like Moscow, where the triangular fortress called the Kremlin was the seat of power, or beautiful St. Petersburg with its canals and European flavor. The art and cultural diversity reflect Russia's complex history. For 10 centuries, these nations and people have joined together, broken apart, and rejoined again. A Scandinavian named Rurik is credited with first uniting Russians in the year 862, but united is a relative term. Despite the deep love of country, a respect for the past, and a spiritual strength, Russia is and always has been a land of individuals. Newlyweds beginning a life together. Farmers, nurses, engineers, window washers, salesgirls, housewives, postal clerks, broadcasters, stewardesses, scientists, typists. The history of the Soviet Union and of Russia itself has been a never-ending battle between the desire for personal freedom and the need for collective strength under a strong leadership. Historically, Russia has been invaded many times, from the south by the Mongols, from the west by the Goths, Huns, Avars, Bulgars. In 1242, the German Order of Teutonic Knights invaded and occupied the northern city of Pskov. Under the leadership of their Grand Master, von Bach, the German knights threatened to enslave the entire population of that area, including the capital, Novgorod. In their hour of peril, the Russian people turned to their prince. This was Alexander Nevsky. Under this charismatic leader, people of many towns and principalities fought together as one to push back the German invaders, and on April 5th, 1242, on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, the consolidated Russian forces met the might of the well-armed German forces. The Russians were not as well organized or as well equipped. Many of the soldiers were simple farmers or tradesmen, but they beat the invaders back, and the sheer bulk of the German armor crashed through the ice. Hundreds of invaders drowned in the frozen winter lake. Nevsky left the Russians with a vow: "He who comes to us with a sword shall perish by the sword." There were many crowns and many czars after the Roman leader Julius Caesar. Tsar Ivan the Great freed his land from the grip of the Mongol domination. His grandson became Grand Duke of Muscovy in 1533. The name Ivan is the Russian variation of John, and because of his conquests and leadership, this prince was given a respectful nickname that implied awesome or ferocious. In later years, the prince became mistrustful, perhaps even homicidal. He was called Ivan the Terrible. Ivan expanded the rule of Muscovy, later called Moscow, to include the provinces of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberia. At home, he crossed the power of the boyars, the elite princes, and chose local leaders instead from the common class, not royalty. But these local leaders often abused their bureaucratic power. Ivan trusted few people. He had seen his mother poisoned when he was a child and suspected the same thing happened to his first wife. He was an autocrat, a strong-willed leader, but he listened to the Duma, a congress of local leaders. Complex, contradictory, Ivan the Terrible proclaimed himself the leader of all the people, Tsar of all the Russians. Tsar Peter the Great was a huge man, brilliant and brutal, fascinated by beauty and pain. He defeated the invading Swedish army at Poltava, and his love of the sea inspired the first modern Russian navy. His fascination with Europe inspired St. Petersburg, later renamed Leningrad, and now once again St. Petersburg. Peter called it a window looking on Europe. and hired French and Italian craftsmen to design a city exceeding Venice and Amsterdam in beauty and elegance. Buildings still bear the double-headed crest of the Romanov family, the dynasty of rulers dating back to Michael Romanov in 1613. These include Catherine I, a servant taken by Peter the Great as his wife, who proved that women could administer Russia with strength and fairness. Catherine II, called Catherine the Great, German by birth, became one of the most respected Russian empresses. Deposing her insane husband, she corresponded with Voltaire, encouraged the birth of Russian literature, yet also made virtual slaves of the serfs and waged war on Turkey and Poland. She annexed the Crimea, the fertile and beautiful land in the Ukraine. Conflicts between Russian government and local inhabitants, plus intervention of Turkey, England, and France, eventually led to the bloody Crimean War in 1854. This three-year conflict was disastrous for Russian troops, who were armed with flintlocks against modern English rifles. In 1807, after losing against Napoleon at the Battle of Friedland, Tsar Alexander I met with the emperor on a barge moored on the river Niemen to sign a peace treaty. Napoleon liked the Tsar personally. He even considered marrying his sister to form a political alliance. But 5 years later, Napoleon and his army moved across conquered Europe into Russian lands. It was his Grande Armée, a gigantic fighting force of trained soldiers recruited from France, Italy, Austria, 500,000 men moving unchecked across the continent, determined to destroy the Russian army, topple the Tsar, and claim the Russian lands and people in Napoleon's unquenchable thirst for power. But the Tsar's army, under direction of General Makutitsov, cheated the little corporal of his victory. The city was set afire, a strategic policy of scorched earth, leaving nothing for Napoleon to conquer, leaving nothing for his huge army to steal or eat. The French emperor got as far as the Tsar's own apartments and watched Russia's greatest city burn through the night. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was finally catching up with Russia, but even in the 1900s, the nation was primarily built on agriculture. Despite the rights that were given and then taken away from the serfs over the decades, they still lived much as they had in the days of Ivan the Terrible. Mechanization was nearly unknown, human labor was cheap, and the farm owners profited from the work, not the laborers. Expansionism of Imperial Germany again pulled Russia into war. Though both Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas were related to England's Queen Victoria, this did not prevent bad blood between them. The complicated mutual defense treaties of Europe and the historical animosity between Russia and Germany promised that war would find them on opposite sides. German strategy included undercutting the Tsar's power, which they did by supporting the revolutionary Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin. Second only to Lenin was Leon Trotsky, born Lev Davidovich Bronstein, a strident and argumentative speaker, yet a master planner and insightful judge of history. Russia was in a state of siege inside and out. Lenin proposed variations on the writings of German theorists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, especially Das Kapital. Marx predicted that the working class of industrial nations would rise against their capitalist masters and create a utopia based on the rule of the community, communism. But even Marx had discounted Russia as a potential for such a revolution, since it had not yet fully become industrialized. Lenin saw great revolutionary promise in the farmer. In November 1916, a conclave of soldiers and royalty conspired to murder Rasputin, to free the Tsar of his influence and save the throne. It was a vain attempt. Spontaneous strikes and demonstrations continued against the throne. Tsar Nicholas abdicated. In a relatively bloodless revolution in late February 1917, the Duma met and proclaimed the beginning of a new provisional government, a democratic republic. Elements of the army joined the revolution. Everywhere from St. Petersburg to the front lines, the drinking, carousing, and celebrating went on for weeks. The nation was free. The war would soon be over. There would be no more elite class of the powerful, no more secret police, no more hardship. But the new interim government was chaotic. There were tsarists who wanted a return to the old ways, wide-eyed anarchists who distrusted all government, right-wing militarists who demanded a strong grip on the state, moderates who wanted a democracy like England or the United States, leftists like the Mensheviks who wanted the workers to rule. Lenin's Bolshevik Party called for all power to the Soviets, small groups of hardcore radicals who followed his Bolshevik Party line. A shrill lawyer named Alexander Kerensky became the figurehead of the unstable melange, fending off continuing assaults on the authority of the provisional government. Bolsheviks loudly disrupted every meeting, demanding Kerensky relinquish his power to the local Soviets. An abortive coup by a right-wing general led to Kerensky releasing hundreds of Bolsheviks from jail. This was a mistake. Aroused by Lenin's promises of bread and peace, Bolshevik supporters under Trotsky's leadership stormed the Tsar's Winter Palace, the site of the democratic government, and Lenin proclaimed a new government, a communist government. Lenin had called his followers Bolsheviks, the Russian word for majority, but they were no such thing. He knew his party could not win in open elections. There would be too many options, too many shades of gray, a rainbow of political thought. To force his revolution into reality, Lenin could not allow compromise or dissent. In the first national election in Russian history, 41 million people voted, and the Bolsheviks got only 25% of the vote. The new Congress convened and voted down all Bolshevik proposals, declaring the country a democratic federal republic. The next day, the delegates returned to Tauride Palace to find it surrounded by armed troops, and another figure emerged from the shadows of power, Joseph Stalin. Lenin and the Bolsheviks still feared a return of the Tsar Nicholas or his heirs. To ensure the absolute end of the Romanov dynasty, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were murdered. Their bodies were tossed down a well and destroyed with quicklime. For years, a rumor circulated that Princess Anastasia had survived the assassination. This appears to have been romantic fantasy. The Romanov dynasty had ended. Death continued on a massive scale at the front. Ultimately, 1,700,000 lives would be lost to the forces of Imperial Germany. The German government had, of course, backed Lenin's insurgent plots against the Tsar. From this quaint apartment in Switzerland, Lenin had dealt with German agents accepting money to print pamphlets, posters, and newspapers. His rivals often claimed Lenin was himself in the pay of Wilhelmstrasse. But it took money to start a revolution. Lenin was pragmatic. He took his enemies' money, then turned his back when they no longer served his purpose. His wife, Krutskaya, was equally devoted to socialist revolution and lived with Lenin while they were both in exile in Siberia. Civil war took a toll inside the nation, ripping it apart. Marauding bands of Bolsheviks sabotaged supply trains bound for White Russian lines. During the Russian Civil War, an American expeditionary force occupied territory in Siberia at the invitation of the White Army. The Soviet government never forgot this. An invasion by the U.S. of Russian territory, though no shots were ever fired. Some divisions of the army used their firepower to defend the tentative new republic. Others remained loyal to the old Tsarist ideals of king and country. Still others wavered between the politics of Lenin, Kerensky, and Duma. The White Russians, civilians, and military loyal to the Tsardom fought the Red Army, followers of Lenin's new communist ideals. The Red Army, like Moscow's Red Square, took its name from the Russian word that also meant beautiful. But red also symbolized blood of patriots, like the Stars and Stripes, and every other nation which uses the color in its flag. Using manipulation, Lenin swayed enough of the working class, the intellectuals, and the military to chart a course. The The bald and goateed Lenin became the unlikely heroic image of freedom and the promise of a utopia. War dragged on endlessly. Russian soldiers retreated or simply walked home. Anti-Semitism was a strong force in Russia. Trotsky, a Jew, had offered to resign if he stood in the way of Lenin's cause. Lenin declined the offer, valuing Trotsky's intellect and dynamism. At Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky negotiated with the Germans, but the terms were brutal. Russia lost the Balkan states, Ukraine, Finland, and part of the Caucasus, but Russia was in no position to argue. Not surprisingly, Lenin wanted a peace treaty with the Germans to stop the war, to solidify his hold on the shaky government. Leftists wanted to continue inspiring revolution throughout Europe and obliterate the old systems of royal rule and capitalist influence. Right-wingers wanted to continue the war against the hated German army to the last man. Moderates wanted peace with dignity and a republic in which all peoples would be represented. Moscow became the new capital. This put some distance between the Tsarist memories of St. Petersburg and the socialist dream of the future, but the change of locale was largely superficial. A brain hemorrhage in 1922 began to remove Lenin from power, but not from sight. Posters featuring heroes of the revolution were pushed as new icons. Lenin, of course, was the most familiar. Over the 74 years of the Soviet Union, variations of this form appeared everywhere, even on advertisements for cigarettes. For a time, Trotsky too became such an icon, until he was declared a non-person. Russia's neighboring nations became socialist states, and in late 1922, a union of these republics, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was born. The new USSR saw enemies in nationalists, moderates, even voices of the left wing that pushed revolution too far under an intellectual sadist named Felix Dzerzhinsky. The Cheka was formed, a secret police force that exceeded even the Tsar's Okhrana in brutal power. Prisons, chains, executions, or banishment to Siberia, even as the Tsar had done to Lenin, became common punishment and a common fear. The Cheka later became known as OGPU, and later the NKVD, then the NVD, and finally the KGB. Despite propaganda paintings like this, Lenin did not trust Stalin. Incapacitated by repeated strokes until his death in 1924, Lenin made it clear in private letters that he thought Stalin would abuse total power if he were to gain control of the new nation. But Stalin was a master manipulator and a ruthless politician. Even while the nation mourned, Stalin assembled communists loyal to him to outmaneuver his rivals. The embalmed body of Lenin came to lie in state permanently as a monument to the new socialist order. Eventually, the mummy was entombed in a beautiful marble mausoleum in Red Square. Trotsky found himself at political odds with Stalin, his minister Molotov, and Beria, the chief of the secret police. Posters praised solidarity and featured happy farmers and workers, but to ensure the country remained on a true course, all political parties were outlawed except the Communist Party. All decisions, all thought, must be filtered through the looking glass of Lenin's brainchild as reinterpreted by Joseph Stalin. Stalin invoked Lenin's name like a religious litany, but his totalitarian methods brought criticism that he was losing sight of the ideals of revolution, that he was molding himself into a communist czar. Anyone who challenged him was an enemy of the state, was removed from power, imprisoned, or executed. Stalin ordered his country purged of dissidents, including early revolutionaries Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Trotsky, who was a threat to Stalin's authority. Trotsky became a non-person. Records were rewritten to eliminate his role in the revolution. Photographs were even altered to remove him from the Russian memory. Stalin ordered him to leave. Trotsky moved from Turkey to France to Norway and finally to Mexico, arguing for communism and against Stalin. He eventually moved to a guarded estate in Mexico. In 1940, an assassin working on Stalin's orders broke into Trotsky's study, murdering him with a pickaxe in the skull. Because of political purges, mock trials, and murders, the Kremlin became known in the Western mind as a mysterious and evil palace of conspirators. In actuality, it was the heart and brain of the USSR, a three-walled citadel which occupied the historic core of Moscow. Within the walls are structures such as Upinsky Cathedral, where the Tsars were crowned, Arkhangelsky Cathedral, with the tombs of the Tsars, and the Grand Palace. Built in the 1800s and rebuilt to hold the Supreme Soviet, the National Parliament, museums, office buildings, and historical sites constantly remind Kremlin visitors of the saga of Russian history. Palaces from the Tsarist era were kept intact as reminders of the extravagance of the Tsars, but also as a source of national pride. Wrote the poet Maxim Gorky, "This art is the beauty which bears witness to the power of the human soul, your history, your pride, soil from which you will grow your new national art." Other fine arts were encouraged, even under the restrictions of communism. One Sergei Diaghilev had created what we have known as modern ballet in 1909. Works by Peter Tchaikovsky, like Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, and Swan Lake, continued to be performed by the Ballet Russe and the Moscow Ballet. Tradition continues with famed Moscow Ballet, which has produced such international stars as Rudolf Nureyev and Mikhail Baryshnikov. Others, like Igor Stravinsky, created revolutions of their own, with dissonant music like The Rites of Spring, known to most people from Disney's film Fantasia. Stalin's five-year plans in the 20s and 30s resulted in some technical achievements that melded usefulness with exquisite beauty, like the subway systems in the major cities, not simply utilitarian like those in New York or London, or coldly modern like the undergrounds in Germany or France. The Russian subway stations often seem like living museums with paintings, statuary, and grand design. The practical and aesthetic success of the subways was a great feather in the cap of the Minister of Transportation, Nikita Khrushchev. An attempt was made to make the vast population literate. As late as 1927, less than 10% of the Communist Party had received higher education. The numbers of unlettered peasants were far greater. National schools were made mandatory, though the lessons always included glowing references to the founders of Russian socialism, Marx, Engels, and Lenin. But to this pantheon came another god, the fatherly figure of Joseph Stalin. But this nervous would-be deity made sure his limo was bulletproof. In 1928, Stalin decreed that his nation would become industrialized. A 5-year plan set impossible goals, but motivated the tired, war-torn people. Giant hydroelectric dams were built to harness power. Labor unions were outlawed. Workers were ordered to improve their output 100%. Oil and steel production actually did go up, though nowhere near Stalin's expectations. Quotas were often met by deviousness. Actual production remained the same or lower, but at least on paper, the state's plans were successful. Alternately brooding and gregarious, convinced of the correctness of his plan for his country, Stalin was an old-fashioned leader, like the best and the worst of the Tsars. Based in Moscow, the Comintern, Communist International, tried to sow the seeds of revolution all over the world, though this practice was often at odds with Soviet diplomats who dealt with foreign governments on other levels. The hopelessness of the Depression made the alternative of communism sound very attractive to those whose lives had been crushed by the failure of capitalism. In the 1930s, hundreds of thousands joined the American Communist Party, but as reforms like Social Security were instituted and the economy improved, the membership dropped dramatically. By the 1950s, there are only a few thousand die-hard communists left in the American Party. But in Germany, Adolf Hitler had grabbed power and written, "When we speak of new territory, we must think of Russia. Destiny itself points the way there." Hitler played on German pride to instigate war, revenge for the humiliation of 1918, and he rebuilt the nation with fascism, iron-fisted control based on a national pride and anti-Semitic hatred. But Hitler's hatred of Jews was matched by his hate and fear of communism. The USSR joined the League of Nations for defense, hoping to avoid war through diplomatic means and collective security. But while some members of the League were vainly pleading for the use of force to stop aggression, the world saw other members, Germany, Italy, and Japan, withdraw from the League in favor of solving disputes on their own terms, with war. Stalin shocked many true believers when he signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939. It was a betrayal of idealism, yes, but this gave Russia time to prepare for a defense. It also opened the door to the Nazi war machine, which breezed through Austria, Czechoslovakia, then into Poland. The Nazis' eastward march was interrupted by France and Britain declaring war on Germany. The Germans turned back, overran France, then turned their attentions to the British Isles. Hitler's general staff used the fear of communism as a propaganda tactic. Though the totalitarian end result of fascism and communism was similar, the socialist concept of equality of all people was something Hitler could not personally stomach nor allow in Germany. It was contrary to his belief in a master race. Traditional enemies of Russia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia soon became allies with Nazi Germany without a war. The reactionary governments in Hungary under Admiral Horthy, Romania, governed by young King Michael, but secretly manipulated by German General Antonescu, and Bulgaria's King Boris, a disciple of Germany's Nazi ideals, all acquiesced to Nazi demands. When the peoples of these nations rose up in anger, the rulers soon invited the Nazis in to keep order. Time was running out for Stalin. The USSR was surrounded by enemies on the west and Japan on the east. Factories so recently built for the machines of peace were hastily refurbished for the tools of war. The Soviet Socialist republics to serve in the Red Army in defense of the Union, the nation, and their peoples. Many served proudly and willingly, but thousands resisted the draft, seeing no honor in fighting for a nation that offered no freedom for themselves or their families. The Nazis had a solid front from the Black Sea to Finland and the ports of the Baltic Sea. The most modern weapons of war, a blitzkrieg lightning war, had proved superior to all other nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France. The Nazi machine seemingly could not be stopped. On June 22, 1941, the Nazis struck 5 areas simultaneously. The storm broke and the Battle of Russia began. More than 2 million men, 200 divisions, plunged into a front 2,000 miles long. Their aim was the annihilation of the Red Army, the obliteration of the USSR. The government and all foreign missions were evacuated 700 miles east to Kuybyshev. Hitler bragged that the enemy had been broken and would never rise again. The Nazis pushed on, occupying 500,000 square miles of Russian territory, equal in size to the entire American Midwest. The old policy of scorched earth prevented valuable food and supplies from feeding hungry German troops. Russian tactics used the great breadth of land as a barrier to the approaching Nazis and used the ancient cities as battlegrounds. Each alley was a shooting gallery. Every house was a potential sniper nest. Low on grenades, the Russians improvised with bottles of gasoline and a flaming rag fuse, naming the weapon after Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Molotov cocktail. At Odessa, the site of the aborted uprising in 1905, Nazis laid siege for 2 months. By holding the town, the Russians prevented the Nazi front from pushing into the Crimea. Soldiers and citizens of the Black Sea Naval Base at Sevastopol resisted every attempt of the Germans to break through. 8 months of shelling, fire, bullets, and mass death. But the Red Army held on to its seaport. Street by street, house by house, the army of the Nazis and the army of the communists fought for their countries and their own lives. Defending its home turf taught the invincible army of the master race a lesson in vulnerability. Millions of Germans died, but no Russian wept for them. But the onslaught continued. Even filtered through Kremlin censorship, the Soviet people saw that the situation was desperate.
This war is not an ordinary war. It is the war of the entire Russian people, not only to eliminate the danger hanging over our heads, but to aid all people.
The familiar propaganda posters now reflected a new tone: hatred for the invader, the call to arms, and a warning of the deadly enemy. Sexual equality was now a reality. In this patriarchal nation, women fought and died along with men in defense of Mother Russia. Retreating from the Germans, the Red Army took everything they could: food, metal, vehicles, supplies, and what couldn't be moved was destroyed. The great hydroelectric dam in the Ukrainian Republic, the pride of Stalin and the men who built it, supplied much-needed heat and power, but that power could help fuel a Nazi conquest. Rather than let it fall into the hands of the Germans, it was destroyed. Stalin used his people's national pride to consolidate the war effort. Let the courageous image of our great ancestors inspire you in this war, he told them. And they were reminded of Alexander Nevsky's historical promise of 700 years before: he who comes to us with the sword shall perish by the sword. The harsh Russian winter was again an ally, a barrier to the invading army, and the churches and synagogues, so long suppressed by the atheistic government, were reopened and used to provide strength, comfort, and the will to fight back. Civilians became guerrilla fighters, sabotaging Nazi camps, destroying railroads, sniping, killing, but there were more than 1 million deserters. Nazis promised independence from Moscow when the war was over. The promise appealed to people of the so-called independent republics: Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Armenia, Turkestan. Thousands preferred the Nazis' promise of freedom rather than accept the fact of communist dictatorship. After the war, thousands were jailed, exiled, or killed for collaboration and treason against the Soviet state. toll of human lives was impossible to calculate. Nearly an entire generation of young men were wiped out in this war, the second gigantic conflict in less than 25 years. As before, the survivors often envied the dead. Russian girls in their teens or even younger were often brutally raped, tortured, and maimed by Nazi soldiers. The Russian resolve was strong. Nazi collaborators were captured and hanged, but to some this revenge didn't mean much. Moscow, Leningrad, even the newly built city of Stalingrad prepared for all-out attack on their homes and their lives. Children aided in the effort to blockade the approaching Germans. A brutal winter, total blockade, and constant bombardment killed hundreds in Leningrad and Stalingrad. With no supplies and no fuel, people died frozen in the streets or huddled in their icy rooms. Finally, a supply line was formed and the sieges were broken. Life returned to the beleaguered cities once more. A massive counteroffensive drove the tired German army back over the plains of Russia, back to Poland, the Balkans, back to the easternmost forest of Germany itself. At the strategic summit meeting in Yalta, FDR and Winston Churchill agreed to allow Stalin to hold the Balkan states as buffers against future aggression. Stalin promised to allow free elections in occupied territory and join the war against Japan. Allied forces stormed and occupied Berlin from all sides, holding back to give the Red Army their moment of triumph and revenge. Captured German soldiers were paraded through Russian streets to the jeers of triumphant crowds. Triumph brought rejoicing and justifiable pride. In Russia, it was not called simply World War II, but the Great Patriotic War. Though his strategy had cost his nation millions of lives, Stalin was hailed as the savior of Russia. Monuments of the unknown soldiers representing the millions who died appeared in nearly every city. Newlyweds traditionally stopped at the local monument on their wedding day to pay respects. The people of the Soviet Union breathed free for the first time in 5 years and looked to the future. 4 years after the United States exploded the first atomic bombs, the Soviet Union exploded one of their own. This, plus the communist domination of Eastern Europe, the so-called Iron Curtain, kept Western powers uneasy. The nation rebuilt the towns destroyed by 4 years of war with the Germans. The aging Stalin wanted his nation to become as modern as those in the West, without the drawbacks like a free exchange of ideas. There were, and still are, many women in the workforce doing jobs previously considered the province of men. This was not just for reasons of equality, though that had long been a communist ideal. The male population of post-war Russia had been decimated. Above the reconstruction, Stalin's image and the emblem of the USSR still hovered, ever present, ever watching. Most industry was still at least partially owned by the state or entirely government-run. Without the motive of profit, workers often lacked the drive to excel, and quotas imposed by the central government in Moscow inspired workers to refine methods of cheating without working. To keep college students in touch with the working class, they were required to spend 3 days a week working on a collective farm or in a factory. Often the only thing they learned was how to get drunk by noon. The amount of vodka absorbed was literally staggering, an average of 4 gallons a year for every person in the USSR. Booze was responsible for 2/3 of all traffic accidents and 90% of the murders in the nation. Yet overall, the quality of life improved. Lenin's image was still everywhere, a reminder of how life had improved since the days of the Tsar. But a generation had passed since then, and that generation craved material goods. They could get them sometimes at the largest department store in the world, GUM, predating the elaborate shopping malls in America, but there were major differences. Though GUM featured everything from candy to shoes, sporting goods to onions, the store and atriums were mostly drafty and unheated. The abacus, a simple calculating device, was the mainstay of all local commerce. Adding machines and cash registers were nearly unknown. In restaurants, no tipping was allowed. That implied a class distinction, a monetary favor bestowed on a servant. This would never do in the classless society. The result, a lot of irritated waiters and waitresses. Stalin's armed forces were one of the few exceptions to poverty. A career in the military often meant better housing, better pay, and a chance for advancement not available in the private sector. Japan had surrendered to the Allied forces in 1945, but the Soviet Union had only declared war on Japan after the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war resulted in Korea being divided along the 38th parallel. Allied troops and Russian soldiers occupied the country together. Up until 1949, the northern half of the country followed the path of communism, the southern half a fascistic form of democracy. When foreign troops left the country, the two Koreas formally split, each declaring that they were the legal government. On June 25, 1950, armies of North Korea invaded the South. The Soviet Union played this cautiously. Though they sold North Korea arms and supplies and undoubtedly sent advisors, technical assistants, and pilots, the Red Army did not enter into the conflict directly. The government of South Korea appealed to the U.S. and then to the United Nations. The USSR had helped found the United Nations in 1944. As a permanent member of the Security Council, a vote to condemn North Korea would mean betraying a communist ally. Voting against the condemnation would make the USSR appear in favor of war. The Soviet delegation remained voluntarily absent from the voting. The Korean War continued, but the USSR kept a discreet distance. UN forces pushed North Koreans back nearly to the border of Red China, but a counterattack by the Chinese, a veritable wall of human flesh, pushed the Allies southward again. At war's end in 1953, the balance was just about exactly where it had began in 1950. Jets were in the skies above Korea on bombing runs, reconnaissance missions, and aerial dogfights, the first jet-to-jet battles in history. The Soviet Union supplied the North Koreans with MiGs, highly maneuverable jets that underwent many refinements over the years. Always on the forefront of aeronautics, Russian engineers continued to advance the MiG design over the decades until it was nearly equal and in some ways superior to fighter jets built in the U.S. Stalin died in 1953. His body lay in state beside Lenin's, but other people kept his influence alive for personal reasons, like Senator Joseph McCarthy, who preyed on the fear and misunderstanding of communism. In the Kremlin, powerful men jockeyed for position, but Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the key figure, becoming first secretary of the Communist Party as well as premier of the Soviet Union. He denounced the evils of Stalin, the murders, the purges, the duplicity, and began to loosen the government grip on its people. The main religion, Orthodox Russian Christianity, had been imposed by Vladimir of Kiev in 989. Catholicism was a distant second in popularity, practiced mostly in Lithuania. Persecuted during the early years of the USSR, religious leaders watched churches become museums. Since religious teaching was forbidden, spiritual leaders taught in secret. Ideas such as life in the hereafter or spiritual guidance might make people question their blind obedience to the state. Constitutionally, freedom of religion was guaranteed in the USSR. In practice, the state often taxed churches out of existence. China's Mao Zedong patterned his government after Lenin's model. Allied with the USSR in the early 1950s, Mao considered Khrushchev's reforms a betrayal of Leninism. By 1958, Mao condemned the USSR as counter-revolutionary, but it was not as if the Soviet Union had yet given up on communism or their authority over nearby nations. In June 1956, strikes and demonstrations in Poland were quashed with the help of Soviet troops. Khrushchev and other members of the Politburo flew to Warsaw to attempt a relatively peaceful compromise. Even more severe was the reaction to the Hungarian uprising later that year. Revisionist communist leader Henry Nagy led a full-scale revolution against the repressive puppet regime seeking to modify communism in that country and become independent from Moscow. Other elements in the country wished to eliminate communism altogether. Kremlin leaders decided to keep the peace with tanks and guns. Crushing the local will of the Hungarian people caused angry reactions everywhere, including inside the Soviet Union. There were strikes, angry demonstrations, and the biggest drop in Communist Party membership since World War II. But the Hungarians could not withstand the overwhelming force of the Red Army. The same pattern occurred a dozen years later in Czechoslovakia, when Soviet troops overruled the moderate communist government of Alexander Dubček. In Soviet schools, such invasions were given an ideological twist. The Red Army were liberators against the forces of evil capitalists. Curriculum invariably included the English language, as well as strong emphasis on science. Education was free, all paid for by the state, but competition was high. Students who flunked their classes might find themselves assigned jobs far below their hopes and dreams, so the pressure was on to excel. The literature available from the West was mostly technical. Anything with political content was either heavily censored or forbidden altogether. News was available through two major newspapers, Pravda and Izvestia. Pravda means truth. Izvestia means news. A familiar Russian joke went, "There is no Izvestia in Pravda and no Pravda in Izvestia." Private newsletters and underground magazines often discussed topics forbidden in the official press, but the thirst for knowledge triumphed even over the official censors. Great palaces of learning like Moscow University, largest educational building in the world, produced a generation of imaginative thinkers. Marxist doctrine tended to stifle social sciences and the humanities, but applied science attracted the cream of Soviet youth. Under Stalin, scientists were expected to prove that all great inventions and discoveries were made by Russians. This foolishness relaxed under Khrushchev. Great strides in atomic theory, chemistry, metallurgy, and electronics were made and applied for practical use in industry and defense. One of the most dramatic Soviet achievements was Sputnik. After the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945, both the Soviets and the Allies had used captured German scientists to further their own rocket programs. The crude V-2 flying bombs of the Nazis provided a head start in rocket propulsion. Scientists on both sides of the Iron Curtain raced to be the first country into outer space. The U.S. program was beset by spectacular failures, explosions on the launch pad, rockets veering off course. The Soviets kept their mistakes secret. Then, on October 4, 1957, they succeeded spectacularly. A 184-pound metal sphere was launched into orbit around the Earth. This was Sputnik. Basically, a radio transmitter that emitted a single repeated beep, but that simple radio signal could be heard anywhere in the world. Compared to the sophisticated satellites of today, Sputnik was crudely simple. but it was the first man-made object to leave the atmosphere of the Earth. The world was electrified. To some, the possibilities were exciting. Exploration of the reaches of space, learning about the moon, the planets, the universe itself. To others, Sputnik could be the harbinger of death from outer space, of orbiting attack platforms ready to destroy American cities. On November 3rd, the USSR followed with Sputnik 2 and the adorable Laika, one of 3 canine volunteers to the space program. Monitored for changes in heartbeat and respiration, Laika gave scientists the information necessary to lay the groundwork for a manned flight into space. Rocketry had a history that actually predated the Russian Revolution. One of the earliest rocketry theorists was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was born in Tsarist Russia in 1857 and died during the reign of Joseph Stalin in 1935. In 1958, Fidel Castro led a revolt against the corrupt right-wing dictatorship of Cuba. The island had been run by wealthy landowners and U.S. corporations. Havana, the capital, had been a haven for gambling, prostitution, and other vices, with a profit split between Cuban dictator Batista and mafia gangsters. Most citizens rejoiced to have the repressive Batista gone, but as with the Russian Revolution, the freedom was short-lived. Castro's word was law. Hundreds were jailed, deported, or executed as Batista sympathizers. Castro embraced the USSR as a socialist ally. Cuba became a virtual protectorate of the Soviet Union, which purchased sugarcane and tobacco at higher prices than normal to balance Cuba's loss of the U.S. as a buyer. While visiting the UN, Castro complained publicly that the CIA was trying to overthrow him and had bugged his hotel room in New York. No one believed him, except perhaps Khrushchev. At a UN speech, Khrushchev announced that communism was more humane than capitalism, that the struggle between moneyed interests and the common people would prove him right. But he used the phrase, "We will bury you." That was viewed as a threat of war, and now, with Cuba only 90 miles from U.S. shores, war seemed a deadly possibility. Worldwide anti-bomb demonstrators were often dismissed by the FBI or the CIA as unwitting dupes of the KGB. Just prior to a peace conference between Khrushchev and Eisenhower in 1960, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory. The U.S. government lied. The Kremlin watched the 1960 presidential race with interest. John Kennedy had a reputation as pragmatic, thoughtful, perhaps even easy to manipulate. He did not have the right-wing tone of his opponent, Richard Nixon. Unknown to the Soviets or the American public, Nixon had a surprise in store for the USSR. He was secretly overseeing an invasion of Cuba, with the CIA coordinating U.S. armed forces and anti-Castro exiles. The Soviet Union also had a surprise in store, but a much more peaceful one. In a training center less than 20 miles outside of Moscow, a group of men prepared for the most daring of all adventures, a rocket flight into outer space. They called themselves cosmonauts, men who sailed the cosmos. A gigantic booster rocket, far larger than the slim missile that propelled Sputnik into orbit, would be launched from a top-secret rocket base. The honor fell to Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Gagarin, a handsome, graceful, and excruciatingly shy young test pilot from the Soviet Air Force. On April 12, 1961, he would make human history. Yuri Gagarin would become the first man into space. Gagarin was a true child of the modern Soviet Union, born on March 9, 1934, on a collective farm near Smolensk, west of Moscow. He attended a manual training school, then went on to a technical junior college at Saratov, where he learned to fly. After graduating the Soviet Air Force Academy with honors in 1955, he soon volunteered for flight into space. Scientists at Star City outside of Moscow could observe the 27-year-old cosmonaut directly with a live broadcast from Gagarin's space capsule. His flight went smoothly, but news of the launch was kept top secret, lest anything go wrong and the Soviet Union become disgraced internationally. the space capsule Vostok 1 completed a single orbit of the globe, a feat unequaled by American astronauts until John Glenn's three-orbit flight in February 1962. Gagarin's spaceflight and other Soviet probes made hard landings in desert areas of the USSR. This procedure increased the danger of a crash, but made it easier to keep secret from the world than NASA's ocean landings. Soviets rejoiced at their hero. Again, the USSR had surpassed America in space technology. It was a worldwide triumph. Sadly, Gagarin died in a plane crash on a routine flight near Moscow in 1968, just after his 34th birthday, but the Soviet space program continued to amass records. First unmanned rocket to the moon in 1957, first double team in space on Grajin Nikolaev, Popovich, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, and the first space station. Images of the future even affected the ubiquitous propaganda posters. The cosmonauts became regular guests at state functions, sources of national pride. Nikita Khrushchev announced that true socialism had been achieved at long last, and that the next step for the USSR was true communism. But in fact, it was capitalism, even in the limited form, that started to improve the economy. The government allowed farmers to work small plots of their own and sell produce at market prices. Though these small private plots only made up 3% of the land, it resulted in 25% of the nation's agricultural output. Though this seemed to be proof that personal profit resulted in harder work, the communist ideals of Lenin were untouchable. As if to make a further break with the past, Khrushchev orders Stalin's body removed from Lenin's tomb. It was buried elsewhere in the Heroes' Cemetery within the Kremlin walls. Regardless of changes in economy or international prestige, the pastimes of the Soviet people remained fairly constant. At the Bolshoi Theater, ballet continued to be popular among all ages, all walks of life, as was grand opera. Other aspects of popular culture wove a thread of propaganda into the fabric of entertainment. Spy films featured handsome and loyal KGB agents battling with the nefarious forces of Western imperialism. James Bond with a Russian accent. Science fiction films often had anti-war and pro-socialist themes. This spaceflight movie featured an international crew on an expedition to Venus. Once there, they realized the civilization of that planet accidentally destroyed itself eons ago while preparing a nuclear assault on the Earth. Soccer, track and field, weightlifting, and personal health remained important in Russian lives. Over the decades, athletes of the Soviet Union won many Olympic medals. Unlike Western nations, though, these athletes were sponsored and housed by the government, groomed from an early age to excel. But the pomp, color, and ceremony of athletic events wasn't that much different from similar activities anywhere in the world. The Moscow Circus remained popular not only in the USSR but worldwide, touring major cities everywhere on every continent. The German city of Berlin remained a problem. Partitioned after World War II, it sat in the heart of communist East Germany. A blockade by communist forces was broken by an Allied airlift in 1949. Riots by Berliners were crushed by Soviet tanks in 1953, but the workforce of East Berlin streamed out into the Free West zone. To staunch the flow of manpower, the communist regime erected a wall of bricks, barbed wire, and booby traps. Khrushchev himself visited Berlin and appeared to approve of the construction. The wall, reinforced over the years with armed guards, watchdogs, and towers, became a symbol of the secrecy and restriction of communist governments. President Kennedy had inherited the disastrous CIA plan to invade Cuba in 1961. The Bay of Pigs landing was repelled by Castro's small army and undercut by Kennedy's unwillingness to supply full-scale military backup. In October 1962, he reaped the harvest of this botched invasion. The Soviet Union had supplied Cuba with long-range nuclear missiles. Now, this was clearly a defense against further U.S. invasions, a deterrent, but it conceivably meant that Castro could launch a first strike against any nation in Central or North America. The Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, denied the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba, but high-altitude U-2 overflights confirmed that the missiles were there and that more were being shipped to the island and that many were operational. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines went on red alert. Long-range bombers flew to fail-safe positions near the Soviet border, ready to drop nuclear payloads on preset targets. Aircraft carriers and submarines with Polaris missiles surrounded Castro's island. Thousands of troops mobilized. Bases in Florida prepared for an invasion or an air assault. The likelihood of Castro launching an invasion against the United States was, of course, virtually nil, but now any false move on either side might trigger an all-out attack. Khrushchev had gambled that the U.S. would not react to the missiles in Cuba, that capitalists like Kennedy were weak and easily intimidated. The blockade prevented further missile shipments. Pentagon hardliners pushed Kennedy to attack Cuba. Khrushchev responded with a private note stating that missiles would be withdrawn, but Kremlin hardliners pushed him for a second, harsher reply: the missiles would stay. Kennedy and his advisors thought fast, then published Khrushchev's first note, removal of the missiles. Both nations stepped back from the brink of annihilation. JFK and Khrushchev had met personally in Vienna the previous year. The Soviet leader judged the young president as bland, even spineless, but Khrushchev sincerely believed the choice was peaceful coexistence or catastrophic war. His ministers and Kennedy's advisors hammered out a treaty to ban nuclear tests in the air, a first step toward a reduction in the arms race that could bankrupt both nations. The peaceful use of nuclear energy in power plants was pushed within the Soviet Union as hard as within the United States. The energy produced by these atom-powered generators helped supply electricity to more and more cities and towns throughout the vast USSR. Russian physicists had made great strides in atomic fission, but often used techniques that were outmoded by Western standards. Since security in the West suspected that Soviet scientists would use nuclear technology to make weapons, improvements on American power plants were often classified, but both sides guarded their secrets and their failures very carefully. Kennedy was proud of his accomplishments in dealing with the Soviet Union, but many in the U.S. felt he'd sold out to the communists, banning H-bomb tests, not invading Cuba with the full might of the armed services. A few select people in the CIA even knew Kennedy was investigating the possibility of restoring relations with Cuba and reducing military presence in Vietnam. Kennedy was shot in Dallas in November 1963. Khrushchev, too, was proud of his accomplishments, especially in industry and agriculture, but Kremlin hardliners felt he'd back down in Cuba, sold out to the U.S. with a test ban treaty, and worried about large cutbacks he planned in the army. In 1964, Khrushchev was ousted from power by Leonid Brezhnev, who took his place as party chairman, with Alexei Kosygin serving as premier of the USSR. The Soviet Union backed Arab nations in the Middle East against what they called Zionist imperialism. Military and industrial relations with Arab nations dated back many years. In 1960, for example, the Soviets aided Egyptian President Nasser in building the gigantic Aswan Dam. But in the Six-Day War in 1967, Soviet-made jets and tanks flown by Egyptian pilots did not fare at all well against U.S. weapons operated by Israeli soldiers. And in Vietnam, this proxy war of capitalism versus communism continued. The USSR provided material to the so-called Army of Liberation led by Communist leader Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. But Brezhnev and the Kremlin leaders did not encourage escalation of the war. As with most other such conflicts, the U.S. found itself propping up a fascistic military dictatorship in the South as bad in its own way as the communist regime. But the difference was American soldiers by the thousands were dying on the battlefield. Communist China entered the scene, which severely strained the already tense relations between China and the USSR. The Soviet Union prudently did not send battlefield troops. Author Alexander Solzhenitsyn revealed to the Soviet Union and the world the horror of Stalin's prison camps in the Gulag Archipelago, for which he won the Nobel Prize. He gained fame with A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, nominated for the Lenin Prize in 1964, but 10 years later he was deported for writing Gulag. Solzhenitsyn turned the profits of his book back to a foundation in Russia to promote free speech. Living standards rose, but so did corrupt abuses of power. When Brezhnev's aged mother saw this collection of expensive motor cars, she said, "This is fine, my dear son, but what if the Bolsheviks return?" The 60th anniversary of the revolution in 1977 was a turning point. Changes in the nation had been tremendous, but the people of the nation would never again permit the totalitarian measures of Stalin's era. The Russian national anthem still stirred the soul, but people questioned whether it was necessary to spend so much money to defend the USSR from an American attack. The Kremlin still supported socialist revolutions overseas, as in Angola and Nicaragua. Communist governments met overseas trade partners if the revolutions were won, and arms deals in the meantime. Cuba continued to be a steadfast ally, as well as a drain on the Soviet economy. Soviet subsidies in sugarcane and tobacco kept Castro in power. When Jimmy Carter became U.S. president in 1976, it appeared for a time that relations between the U.S. and the USSR would truly become peaceful. Discussions of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty led to a summit meeting between Carter and Soviet leader Brezhnev and the signing of an international agreement to reduce nuclear armaments. Carter voiced optimism, but the U.S. Senate never ratified the SALT Treaty. Right-wingers warned Carter that the Soviet government could not be trusted. Events in the Mideast seemed to prove their point. In December 1979, to help prop up a two-year-old communist regime, the Red Army invaded Afghanistan. The Kremlin insisted the army had been invited, as they had been invited into Czechoslovakia and Hungary. The soldiers were told they were fighting agents of the CIA and Red China, but it was the Afghani Mujahideen who shot back. As the war drew on, thousands of soldiers died or returned home as disillusioned veterans, oppressors instead of victors. Afghanistan was their Vietnam. President Carter changed his mind about the peace-loving Soviet government. But above the earth, there was still a chance for cooperation and peace. The Soviet and American space programs ceased their rivalry and instead joined forces in a joint procedure in the stratosphere. On July 17, 1975, a Soviet Soyuz capsule docked with NASA's Apollo spacecraft. The three astronauts shook hands with the two cosmonauts, and for 2 days the international team performed scientific and astronomical experiments that benefited research scientists in all countries of the world. The special medal minted for the occasion symbolized the joining of the people of both nations. Relations between U.S. presidents and Soviet premiers had always seemed cordial, at least superficially, but Neither president nor premier had the complete power to control either nation's huge military establishment. Industries thrived on creating new weapons, faster attack jets, bigger subs. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party, who knew his nation needed drastic reforms to survive. He and his wife, Raisa, became a familiar sight everywhere. He proposed drastic cuts of defense budgets. That did not sit well with the military, and he began a policy of glasnost, openness. Censorship was nearly eliminated. Accompanying Gorbachev in his rise to power, his blustery protege, Boris Yeltsin, a blunt, hard-drinking Russian. Gorbachev met with Ronald Reagan in Geneva in 1985. Through a combination of Gorbachev's charm and Nancy Reagan's pressure on her husband to go down in history as a peacemaker, Reagan moved away from his long-held view of the USSR as an evil empire.
We met as we had to meet. I called for a fresh start, and we made that start. I can't claim that we had a meeting of the minds on such fundamentals as ideology or national purpose. But we understand each other better, and that's a key to peace.
I would still be so bold as to say that the world has become a more...
Gorbachev was a world leader in peace, but high prices and scarce commodities back home shifted public opinion against him. He urged his nation to proceed one step at a time. Fed up with compromise, Yeltsin walked out on his mentor and on the Communist Party itself. Western influence began appearing everywhere. The great masses of Russians, Georgians, Ukrainians, and all the peoples of the Soviet Union, tired of the system that seemed to offer so little in material goods, so little true representation in government. Though Gorbachev's process of perestroika started to thaw the Cold War, Soviet citizens were more concerned about their own destinies than the fate of nations. Capitalism reared its head on street corners, vendors selling their wares. The voice of youth rang out in rock and roll. Like their counterparts in the West, Russian rockers sang of love, death, and rebellion. Exposure to Western life through music, films, books, and TV erased many differences between Russian youth and those in the West. Some young toughs hang out in pool rooms. Skateboarders became a common sight. College students joke to foreigners that the first thing they do when they graduate is to forget everything they learned about Lenin. In harsher times, the central government tried to erase local culture, though areas like Armenia, Georgia, the Baltic states, and the republics of Central Asia hung on to their traditions. As restrictions loosened, nightclub entertainment often featured updated versions of local culture that went back centuries. But major cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and especially in the republics of Latvia and Lithuania frequently featured entertainment more akin to Las Vegas. Western influence such as this were branded decadent in the Stalinist era. The term was probably still appropriate, but the public still wanted it. I have seen the future, and it worked, wrote an observer of the Soviet system in the 1930s, but in the 1980s, the future broke down. At the atomic power plant near Chernobyl, technicians tested the emergency shutdown system of one of the 4 nuclear reactors. Rods of graphite, which control the reaction inside the core, were removed. Within 50 seconds, the nuclear reaction was out of control. The temperature inside the reactor rose hundreds of degrees. It was too late to reinsert the graphite control rods. The core and the containment wall around it began to burn and melt. A huge explosion scattered more than a ton of deadly radioactive debris into the air. Amidst the rubble of the reactor building, the red-hot fissionable material hissed and burned, unspeakably deadly. The Red Army, so long waiting to battle human invaders, now mobilized to battle an invisible enemy. To To prevent the molten radioactive core from melting through the floor and into the ground where it would contaminate the water table, subway workers tunneled below the reactor to establish a cement underfloor. The strict control of information in the Soviet Union magnified the problem. The men in charge of the power plant had lost precious time before admitting they had a problem. Though the explosion had been heard miles away, local officials hesitated in alerting central authority in Moscow, afraid of the consequences. Military and civilian volunteers came from every area of the nation. Workers in the shattered reactor building remained inside only 15 minutes at a time to prevent overexposure to radiation. Local officials attempted to downplay the danger. Though tons of radioactive debris had already escaped, the nearby population was not alerted for many hours. Even when they were, they scarcely believed it. After all, they'd been assured that the reactor was safe. The government had told them so. The firemen, soldiers, and laborers who volunteered to battle this invisible monster literally risked their lives so that innocent people could survive. Equipment and personnel received constant hosing down to eliminate radioactive dust and debris. Forests around the city were deliberately torched. Trees had absorbed so much radioactivity they were in danger. Mountains of contaminated dirt was excavated from the disaster site and transported to distant areas sealed in concrete. The Ukrainian cameraman who filmed the operation knew the risk, but felt it was important to show the world. He died a year later from radiation poisoning. Borne on the wind, debris from Chernobyl sailed past the Soviet borders. Geiger counters went off in Finland, Sweden, even Switzerland. In Poland, children were given iodine to prevent long-term problems with thyroid cancer. In the far north, wildlife was irradiated like laboratory rats. Nomadic peoples like the Lapps saw their reindeer herds rendered useless for food and skins. Chernobyl, like 3 Mile Island, revived the question of nuclear safety. Was it worth the risk? The Soviet Union's 50 online nuclear facilities only supplied 12% of the nation's power. Many officials at Chernobyl were fired from their positions and prosecuted. One committed suicide on the first anniversary of the accident. The reactor itself was buried with hundreds of tons of concrete, a giant sarcophagus. Gorbachev pulled the Soviet army out of Afghanistan. This attempt at enforcing the rule of a country by force had ended as badly as the U.S. presence in Vietnam. Gorbachev continued courting the U.S., immensely popular when he visited New York City, but his stated desire for arms reduction and a reduction of the huge tax debt it took to continue the arms race was frustrated by Ronald Reagan's outlandish plan of a new generation of expensive weapons based in outer space, the Space Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. Elaborate, untested, gigantically expensive, this theoretical umbrella against the incoming missiles promised to renew the nuclear arms race 100 times over. The concepts of equality and freedom that communism had promised were finally seen for what they were, empty promises. As if he sensed time was running out, Gorbachev encouraged manufacturers to follow the Western path, private ownership rather than state-run industry. Still, Gorbachev remained a believer in communism. If the party could be reformed, if the bureaucracy could be eliminated, if the military spending could be cut back, if both the U.S. and the USSR would dismiss the imaginary threat of all-out war, if all these things could be changed, the communist system could work, but change would take time. To make sure he had the time necessary for reforms and the power necessary to control the vast bureaucracy, he appointed many old-time right-wingers to important cabinet posts, right-wingers who still profess belief in the system of Vladimir Lenin. The beginning of the end began in Germany. The Berlin Wall came down, paving the way for the reunification of East and West Germany after 4 decades. Now, the peoples of the Soviet Union themselves demanded freedom to choose. Demonstrations erupted in towns across the nation. In the Kremlin, Leaders on the left, right, and center pondered on what direction to take. Too much change and too soon would cause chaos. Too little change could cause backfire into open rebellion. Gorbachev tried to hold everything together on personality and faith, but not all the national leaders shared that faith. Even stripped of authority by Gorbachev, Yeltsin became president of the Russian Republic in the first open election in 70 years, a symbol of defiance against the party and central government. Right-wingers worried that Yeltsin's independence and Gorbachev's continuing glasnost would become a Frankenstein, an unstoppable force that would split the nation apart into independent areas. But at least the press was now free to report the truth, unhampered by censors. Riots in the Baltic states underlined the reactionary view that the situation was out of hand. Firm control must be restored even at the expense of personal freedoms. 4 million disillusioned people quit the Communist Party within 2 years. Gorbachev agreed to reorganize the Soviet Union, granting more independence to the various republics, more power to control their own national destiny at the expense of the established Soviet power brokers. Some in the Supreme Soviet saw this as treason. The weekend before Gorbachev was to sign a new Union treaty, he was taken hostage in his vacation home in the Crimea. Soviet television announcers then stated that Vice President Gunnar Unyev had assumed control of the government. Reporters stated the official story that Gorbachev had taken ill, but the lie was transparent. This was a coup d'etat, a seizure of power by desperate men. There was Buklanov, first deputy of the USSR, Khrushchev, KGB chairman, Pavlov, Soviet prime minister, Puko, interior minister, Yasov, defense minister. Armed troops entered Moscow. The new leaders nervously declared a 6-month state of emergency to halt inflation, unrest, and rebellion, and vowed to restore law and order. It would later be learned that Unyev and most of his fellow plotters were drunk when they rashly decided to seize power, but drunk or sober, they felt that Gorbachev's policies would cause the collapse of the Soviet Union. Tanks rolled down the city's highways. It looked as if the promise of glasnost, the dream of a democratic nation, was evaporating. Yeltsin defied the coup as he had defied Gorbachev, demanded the truth of Gorbachev's so-called illness, demanded the return of the Soviet leader. But the hardliners were prepared to crush any rebellion like they had in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The usually outspoken Lech Walesa of Poland was cautious. There were still many thousands of Soviet troops stationed within the Polish borders, but other leaders, communists and capitalists alike, damned the overthrow as illegal and demanded Gorbachev be released. Gorbachev recorded a message on a home video camera explaining his view on the coup. He did not know if the world would ever see the video.
And I've twice tried to reach him by phone, including within the last hour, but have so far been
3 young men were killed, martyrs to the Second Revolution. Tanks and troops loyal to Yeltsin surrounded the Russian Federation building to prevent an attack. Nervous citizens threw up barricades around the Federation building. From within, Yeltsin loyalists kept in touch with the rest of the world by radio, television, and fax. Outside in the dark Moscow streets, angry mobs blew up buses and attacked tanks with sticks, stones, and Molotov cocktails. Tens of thousands surrounded the Federation building, prepared for bullets, bombs, or gas. They cheered as Yeltsin continued to stand firm against the coup. But Red Army soldiers turned out to be loyal to the Soviet people, not the government. Even the elite forces refused to fire upon their own brothers and sisters. In a broadcast studio within the besieged building, Yeltsin promised, "The honor of Russian arms will not be covered with the blood of our people." The military ignored the coup leaders, and Gorbachev was able to reach the outside world.
It's a good call. Gorbachev is still in the Crimea. He will return either tonight or tomorrow to Moscow. People know of my respect for Gorbachev, indeed the way I feel about him, and I was just delighted to hear that he was fine.
3 days after it began, the coup collapsed. Democracy had triumphed. Healthy but shaken, Gorbachev returned. Order was restored, but the Soviet power structure was irrevocably shaken. Though Gorbachev tried to keep some remnant of his government, it was too late. The genie had been released from the bottle. The hammer and sickle representing farmer and laborer was replaced with the tricolor of pre-revolutionary Russia and a dozen other flags throughout the many separate lands: Georgia, Ukraine, Moldavia, Estonia, Lithuania. The statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the KGB, was removed, as were statues of Stalin and even Lenin himself. In some ways, it was an eerie replay of the 1917 revolution. Gorbachev himself quit the Communist Party, but warned that abrupt change could cause destruction. Yeltsin pressed his case, forming a commonwealth of independent states. The Soviet state had the power for only one last action: dissolving itself. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, the last president of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There was still a lack of food. The sudden open market, long supported by state subsidies, made the purchasing power of the ruble drop dramatically. And there were grave questions about the future, but after 7 decades of communism, after 1,000 years of totalitarian rule, the people looked ahead to an uncertain but promising future. Words from the poet Gogol applied to this new commonwealth as they did to Russia 150 years ago. Russia, are you not speeding along, fiery and matchless? Beneath you the road is smoke, the bridge is thunder, and everything is left far behind. Russia, where are you flying? The air is torn and thundering as it turns to wind. Everything on earth comes flying past, and looking askance at her are the peoples, and states move aside and make way.